Today, Philosophy Insights did some special editing of Jordan Peterson's lecture, and I hope you enjoy the content.
Facing what you're afraid of. And that's a key concept in psychotherapy. There's not that many key concepts in psychotherapy. One might be that you enter into an honest relationship with your client. The second is that exposure to the things that you don't want to be exposed to is curative if it's voluntary. That's a big deal. And it has to be voluntary. It can't be involuntary because that'll just make it worse. Because you might ask, well, you know, if a kid has a fear of rats or mice, they got that fear because often they were exposed to rats or mice, and then you use exposure to rats and mice to cure them. Well, that makes the precipitator of the illness the cure, which makes no sense. Well, what's the distinction? Well, it's one thing to have something pop up at you when you're not expecting it. That puts you in a state of apprehension and preparation for action, in a state of, even a state of terror, a state of reflexive shock, and then perhaps terror, and maybe something you don't recover from. That's completely different than facing something voluntarily. The psychophysiology isn't even the same. So if you're faced with a stressor of a certain magnitude and it's involuntary, your body produces a lot of the stress hormone cortisol. And in large doses, cortisol is toxic, especially if it's produced over long periods of time. But if you face it voluntarily, then that doesn't happen. You use a completely different set of circuits to do something voluntarily. And it's the utilization of the voluntary circuits that indicates your mastery over the thing that you're afraid of. And that mastery over the thing that you're afraid of and can't cope with, that actually constitutes your adaptive personality. And so part of what the existentialists were suggesting is that precisely, and you see this in Freud with his insistence that you go into your messy past and dig up the corpses and the skeletons and sort them out, and Jung's insistence that what you want most is to be found where you least want to look, and Roger's insistence that people communicate honestly about difficult things. It's all predicated on the same idea, in some sense, that voluntary exposure is one of the prime things that cures people. And one of the things that you should think about, you think, well, is that a valid claim? Well, you have the psychophysiological evidence, but it's also the case that that is how people learn, right? If you're a child and you're learning to master the world, you actually exist in a state of existential anxiety unless you're near someone that will take care of you. So for example, if you take the typical child and you go to a mall, say a 3-year-old, and then you have the 3-year-old stand and you leave, it isn't going to be very long till you're far enough away so that most children in that situation will immediately start to cry. They'll get worried and they'll start to cry, and then they'll break down because that's the existential anxiety. Like you think, well, a normal child is calm. It's like, wrong. A normal child close to someone who will take care of them is calm, but that is by no means the same thing. It's not even close to the same thing. And so you get backwards in your psychological thinking if you don't notice that, because you think, well, the normal human being is calm and well put together. It's like, no, wrong. The normal human being in a place of safety is calm and well put together. But why you would ever think that a normal place is a place of safety, you know, assuming that that's the standard or the norm, there's absolutely no reason for that. You see this with rats too, because the behaviorists, for example, made the presumption that you had to teach rats to be afraid. But let me tell you how that actually worked. It's really interesting, and it shows you how carefully you have to analyze, say, psychological experiments to understand what's going on. So let's say you take a lab rat, okay, and let's say it's a lab rat like a rat that Skinner used, B.F. Skinner, who is the most famous of the behaviorists, and he could get rats to do anything. He taught pigeons to play ping pong. He taught pigeons to guided missiles by photographs, and he did that with behavioral training. They were never used for guided missiles because they got the electronics working before the program was set into operation. But he could get them to peck at photos to guide something that was flying accurately, and he did that with behavioral training. So Skinner, I mean, he was no joke. He really knew how to train animals, and it's very useful material to know. We'll talk about it to some degree if you want to train children, for example, or pets. So, because the learning mechanisms are very similar, which is why, of course, we can get along with pets, right? We understand them like we understand children, roughly speaking. So, anyways, so let's say you've got your rat and he's sitting there and he's pretty calm and he's in his cage. And so he's already a weird rat because he's been genetically altered. He's not a wild Norway rat. So he's a little tamer than a normal rat. Maybe he's a little more fearful, although perhaps not. And he's also a solitary rat in his cage, and there's no such thing as a solitary rat. It's like a solitary zebra or a solitary carp, not carp, cod. Cod exist in huge schools. There's no such thing as a cod, which is why they will never come back, as far as I can tell, because once you wipe out the school, it's like you wipe out a beehive and you're going to have 6 bees. What the hell are you going to do with 6 bees? What are they going to do? They don't exist on their own. And herd animals are like that too, and cod are like that. So they organize their mating behavior in their huge schools. So without the schools, like what the hell is a cod going to do? Nothing. And that is what they're doing. But anyways, back to the rat. So you've got this rat, he's in a cage, he's alone, and he's hungry, because one of the things that Skinner did was starve his rats down to 75% of their normal body weight so that they would respond a lot more to food. So that's the model, and that you got to keep in mind the nature of the model, because the model is like, the way the model is constituted is equivalent to your implicit assumptions about your experiment. And people don't take that into consideration. Okay, so the rat's calm. So then what you do is you take the rat out of his cage and you put him in the testing chamber. And so maybe what you're going to do is you're going to set the rat up so that a light goes on and then he gets a little electric shock, okay? And that you're going to teach him to be afraid of the light. So after you pair the light with the shock 6 or 7 times, when the light comes on, the rat's going to freeze. And he freezes because he's using predator avoidance strategy basically to deal with the threat. And so you think, well, calm rat learns to be afraid. But no, because when you put the rat in the cage, the new cage, what does it do? Well, it doesn't just, find the sofa and have a nap. It's terrified when you put it in the new situation. That's the normal rat. It's the one that's like this. It doesn't move, because if it moved, maybe a predator would pick it out, like a cat, because cats can see lateral movement. That's why they have slit eyes, by the way, so they can detect lateral movement. And you know that because if you play with your cat like this, it'll chase your hand, but if you do this, it won't. It's because it doesn't chase things that do this. It doesn't chase kangaroos, it chases things that move like this, so it has eyes for that. Anyways, the rat's frozen. And then it starts to sniff, because a rat is all smell. The brains of most animals are organized around smell. Human beings are very weird, because our brains are organized around vision. But that's just not the case for most, dogs. They're the weirdest things, because they can smell like way better than you. They can detect odors way better than you. Probably most of you smell better than a dog. But they can detect odors better than you. But everything seems to smell good to a dog, which is the strangest damn thing, With a nose like that, you'd think they'd never even want to go outside. But anyways. Uh-oh. Now I probably lost my place. All right. Dogs, smell. Where were we going with that? Rats. Yes. And what's that? Frozen, yes, okay, so the rat, that's the one. So the rat is in its cage, and it's frozen so that nothing can see it and eat it. And so it starts to sniff, because it uses smell to see what's going on. And so if you take rats that have never been exposed to a cat, and you, blow cat odor over them, they do not like that at all. They do not like cat odor, so it's built right into, it's an archetype. The predator cat is an archetype for the rat, and it doesn't need any pre-training to respond to it. And it's probably also the case with human beings and things like snakes and looming objects. We've got some archetypal predators as well. But all right, so the rat sniffs, and then if nothing happens, it thinks, okay, a rat can sniff here without dying. And so then it starts to relax a little bit, and maybe it starts to move around a bit, and then it thinks, okay, a sniffing rat that's moving a little bit can live here without dying. And then nothing else happens, and so it relaxes a bit more, and then it starts to sniff its way around, and it'll sniff all around the cage and check out all the corners and make sure that there isn't anything there that can eat it, because the rat actually cares about that. And then when it's completely explored the cage and decided that it's safe, then it turns into a normal, calm rat. But that's post-exploration. So you have to say, well, a rat that has thoroughly explored its territory is a calm rat. That's a whole different way of looking about fear. Then you turn the light on and shock it, and the rat thinks, wrong. It's not safe here, and that light indicates that it's not safe. So basically what you've done is remind the rat that life is dangerous. You have not taught it fear. It's not the same thing. The rat knows everything about fear. It learned that it was safe and it was wrong. And that's a really important thing to understand also about what you're like. Because you know, like anxiety, that needs no explanation. Depression, that needs no explanation. What needs explanation is how the hell do you ever feel secure and together ever? Because that's the mystery. And partly the way you do that is by never going anywhere where you're upset. You stay in your territory. And so like this is your territory and everyone knows how to act here, right? So you look around and everyone's sitting and doing exactly the same thing, so you can ignore them. You can pretend that they're not dangerous. And most of the time, that will be correct. And some of the time, it won't be. And so you maintain your emotional stability by staying where you belong. And that's quite different than the psychoanalytic view, you know, that you're calm and well put together if your psyche is properly organized.